To understand Vizcaya, you must first strip away the modern image of Miami. You must erase the neon lights of South Beach, the high-rise condos of Brickell, and the traffic on I-95. You have to go back to 1910. At that time, Miami was not a metropolis. It was a frontier. It was a humid, mosquito-infested strip of land sandwiched between the unforgiving sawgrass of the Everglades and the turquoise silence of Biscayne Bay. It was a place of heat, sweat, and mangroves. It was the last place on Earth you would expect to find the ghost of the Italian Renaissance. But in the Gilded Age, money did not follow logic. It followed the whims of men who believed they could terraform reality. And the money behind Vizcaya was old, deep, and industrial. It came from the heartland of America, from the wheat fields and the corn rows. It came from the International Harvester Company. James Deering was not your typical robber baron. He was not a chest-thumping capitalist like J.P. Morgan, nor was he a ruthless monopolist like Rockefeller. He was a different species of aristocrat entirely. He was the bachelor prince of the American Midwest, born into the staggering wealth of the Deering Harvester Company, which manufactured the machines that allowed America to feed the world. James was a man who lived in the shadow of his own fragility. He was 51 years old in 1910. He was tall, fastidious, impeccably dressed, and socially elusive. He had never married. He had no children. And most importantly, he was sick. He had been diagnosed with pernicious anemia, a condition that in the early 20th century was often a slow death sentence. His doctors gave him a prescription that was common for the wealthy invalids of the era. Go south, find the sun, avoid the cold. So James Deering looked at the map of Florida. He didn't want a hotel. He didn't want a cottage. He wanted a winter home that would act as a sanctuary, a place where he could live out his remaining years in a beauty so profound it might keep death at bay. But James Deering didn't have the imagination to build Vizcaya on his own. He had the checkbook, yes, but he lacked the madness. For that, he needed Paul Chaffin. The relationship between James Deering and Paul Chaffin is the beating heart of the Vizcaya story. It is one of the most fascinating and complex partnerships in architectural history. Chaffin was an artist, a curator, and a man of intense, almost feverish aesthetic vision. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He had been a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He was charming, manipulative, brilliant, and utterly obsessed with European beauty. When Deering hired Chaffin to help him build a house in Florida, he thought he was hiring an interior decorator. He was wrong. He was hiring a director. Chaffin didn't see a house. He saw a stage set. He saw an opportunity to create a masterpiece of illusion. He looked at the scrubland of Miami and saw the coast of Venice. He looked at the mangrove swamps and saw the gardens of Tuscany. The two men embarked on a journey that would become legendary. In the summer of 1912, they boarded a steamship for Europe. This wasn't a vacation, it was a raid. They traveled through Italy and France with a single purpose: to buy the past. Most millionaires of the time, like the Vanderbilts, bought furniture to put inside their houses. Deering and Chaffin bought the houses to put around their furniture. They didn't just buy chairs and tables. They bought walls. They bought ceilings. They bought fireplaces. They bought gates. They would walk into a crumbling palazzo in Venice or a decaying chateau in France, point to a 16th century marble doorway, and say, "We'll take it." Workers would dismantle the stone, crate it up, and ship it to a warehouse in Dayton, Ohio, to wait for the house that didn't exist yet. They bought the roof tiles from an entire Cuban village to get the right, weathered look. They bought the gates from the Pisani Palace in Venice. They bought a rug that had belonged to the grandfather of King Ferdinand of Spain. It was a shopping spree of imperial proportions. But Chaffin did something even more brilliant. He didn't just buy objects. He invented a story. He realized that a brand new Italian villa sitting in the middle of the Florida jungle would look ridiculous if it looked new. It would look like a cheap reproduction. It needed the weight of time. It needed ghosts. So Chaffin and Deering created a fiction. They invented a legend of Vizcaya. They decided to build the house as if it had been standing there for 300 years. The backstory they concocted was incredibly detailed. They imagined that the house had been built in the 16th century, by an unnamed Venetian explorer who had come to Florida. They imagined that this explorer had built a fortress to protect himself from pirates. Then, they imagined that his son had softened the house, adding Rococo details in the 18th century. Then, they imagined that his grandson had added neoclassical details in the 19th century. This wasn't just a daydream, it was the blueprint. They designed the house to look like it had been renovated by 4 generations of the same fictional family. They deliberately built mistakes into the architecture to make it look like it had evolved over centuries. They mixed styles, Renaissance, Baroque, neoclassical, not because they were confused, but because they were trying to simulate the passage of time. They hired an architect, F. Burrell Hoffman, to execute this vision. Hoffman was young, talented, and patient. He had the thankless job of taking Chaffin's hallucinations and making them stand up in a hurricane zone. While Chaffin was dreaming of gondolas, Hoffman was worrying about wind loads and foundation rot. The site they chose was a 180-acre tract of land in Coconut Grove. It was a dense, tangled hammock of tropical hardwood trees, teeming with land crabs, snakes, and humidity. It was a jungle. To the locals, the idea of building a European palace there was insanity. The salt air would eat the stone. The sun would fade the tapestries. The storms would wash it away. But Deering was adamant. He wanted the bay. He wanted the water. He wanted to look out his window and see the same view that Ponce de Leon might have seen. The preparation of the site began in 1914, and it was a declaration of war against the Florida landscape. They didn't just clear the land, they terraformed it. They had to build a house that was essentially floating on a sponge. The water table in Miami is only a few feet below the surface. You cannot dig a basement in Miami. You hit water immediately. So they built up. They brought in draglines and dredges. They carved out a lagoon. They built an artificial hill to give the house elevation so it would catch the breeze. They were engineering a mountain in a place that is fundamentally flat. But the most audacious part of the plan was the approach. Chaffin decided that you shouldn't just drive up to the front door. That was too pedestrian. He designed a winding road through the dark, preserved jungle. He wanted the visitor to drive through the menacing, wild, tropical forest, the hammock, so that when they finally burst into the clearing and saw the pale, sun-drenched Italian villa, the shock would be total. It was a transition from the heart of darkness to the age of enlightenment. James Deering wrote checks that would make a modern billionaire flinch. The budget was non-existent. If Chaffin wanted a specific shade of pink marble that could only be found in a quarry that had been closed since the Roman Empire, Deering would pay to reopen the quarry. If they needed a specific type of shell for the grottos, they would hire locals to scour the beaches of the Bahamas. There was a silence at the center of this project. James Deering was a quiet man. He was not like the Vanderbilts, who built houses to scream at their neighbors. Deering was building Vizcaya for himself. He was building a bachelor's paradise. He was a man who knew he was dying, or at least declining, and he wanted to create a world where he was the absolute monarch. He was obsessed with privacy. He designed the house to be a fortress against the prying eyes of society. He didn't want the Newport crowd. He didn't want the social climbing. He wanted a place where he could wear his white suits, drink his cocktails, and watch the moon rise over the bay in perfect stillness. But there was a tension in the air. Europe was on the brink. The year was 1914. While Deering and Chaffin were shipping crates of art across the Atlantic, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was being assassinated in Sarajevo. World War I was exploding. The shipping lanes were becoming dangerous. The German U-boats were beginning to prowl the ocean. Vizcaya was being built against the clock. They were trying to extract the beauty of Europe before Europe destroyed itself. It was a race. They were pulling tapestries out of France just as the trenches were being dug. They were shipping stone out of Italy just as the borders were closing. Vizcaya became a lifeboat for European culture, a desperate attempt to transplant the soul of the old world to the safety of the new world before the bombs fell. As the first pilings were driven into the coral rock of Miami, the locals watched with skepticism. They saw a rich northerner throwing his money into the swamp. They called it Deering's folly. They didn't understand that they were witnessing the birth of the most significant house ever built in the American tropics. They didn't know that this wasn't just a house. It was a magic trick made of stone. The stage was set, the jungle was waiting, the money was flowing, and James Deering, the frail king of the harvest, was preparing to build his dream on the edge of the water, defying the climate, the war, and logic itself. The construction of the American Venice was about to begin. The physical construction of Vizcaya was an act of violence against the Florida landscape, disguised as a romance. When the first shovel broke ground in 1914, the site was not a garden. It was a hostile wilderness. The hammock, the dense, tangled forest of tropical hardwoods, was impenetrable. The mangroves along the shoreline were a wall of roots and mud, teeming with crocodiles and clouds of mosquitoes so thick they could suffocate a man. To build an Italian villa here was not just ambitious. It was an act of architectural terraforming that required the logistics of a military campaign. James Deering did not just hire a construction crew, he hired a literal army. At the peak of construction, over 1,000 men were working on the site. To put that number in perspective, the entire population of Miami in 1914 was roughly 10,000 people. This meant that 10% of the city was employed by James Deering. He wasn't just building a house, he was the primary economic engine of South Florida. The workforce was a melting pot of the Caribbean and the American South. There were Bahamian stonecutters, master masons from Italy, laborers from Georgia, and craftsmen from New York, all sweating in the humid, oppressive heat of the tropics to build a fantasy for a man from Chicago. The first challenge was the stone. Paul Chaffin, the artistic director, wanted the house to look like it had grown out of the earth. He didn't want imported marble for the exterior, he wanted the local rock. The bedrock of Miami is oolitic limestone, a jagged, porous coral rock that is notoriously difficult to work with. It is full of fossils, shells, and holes. It looks like a petrified sponge. But when cut and exposed to the air, it hardens into a material as durable as granite and turns a beautiful, soft, golden white color. Deering hired Bahamian artisans who knew the secrets of this stone. They quarried it right there on the property. They cut massive blocks of coral rock, some weighing tons, and used them to face the building. This is the first great illusion of Vizcaya. When you look at the house, it appears to be a solid fortress of ancient coral, but it is a lie. Beneath the romantic, textured coral facade lies a skeleton of pure, industrial-grade reinforced concrete. F. Burrell Hoffman, the young architect, knew that he wasn't building in Tuscany. He was building in the hurricane capital of the world. He designed the house to be a bunker. The walls are thick, steel-laced concrete. The floors are concrete. The roof is anchored with steel. Vizcaya was built to survive the apocalypse. While Chaffin was obsessing over the color of the drapes, Hoffman was calculating wind loads for a Category 5 storm. It was the perfect marriage of the aesthetic and the pragmatic, a house designed to look like a crumbling ruin, but built to withstand a direct hit from God. But the most audacious feature of the construction wasn't the house itself. It was the breakwater. James Deering wanted the house to sit right on the water, like the palaces of Venice. He wanted the bay to lap against the steps of his terrace. But Biscayne Bay is not the Venetian lagoon. It is choppy, shallow, and prone to violent storm surges. If you build a terrace on the water in Miami, the waves will smash it to pieces within a year. Hoffman told Deering they needed a seawall. A normal millionaire would have built a concrete barrier, a simple line of defense. But Paul Chaffin forbade it. He said a concrete wall would ruin the view. It would look industrial. It would destroy the illusion of the Italian fantasy. So they came up with one of the most insane and delightful structures in American architecture, the barge. Instead of a wall, they built a massive stylized sculpture of a boat made of stone. It sits in the water, about 20 feet off the main terrace. It acts as a breakwater, absorbing the energy of the waves so the water is calm by the time it hits the house. But it doesn't look like a breakwater. It looks like a sunken pleasure barge from the Roman Empire. They hired the famous sculptor Alexander Sterling Calder, the father of the man who invented the mobile, to decorate it. He carved massive mermaids, sea monsters, and obelisks out of the local limestone. They planted trees on the deck of the stone boat. They built a tea house on it. It was a folly of the highest order. It was a functional piece of marine engineering disguised as a piece of decadent art. It allowed Deering to sit on his terrace and look out at a calm, reflective pool of water, while the stone mermaids took the beating of the bay for him. As the shell of the house rose, the logistics of the interior began to spiral out of control. Remember, Deering and Chaffin had bought the rooms first. They had warehouses full of ceilings, fireplaces, and paneling from Europe. Now they had to fit them into the concrete shell. This process was like solving a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle where none of the pieces were the same scale. The reception room, for example, was designed around a specific set of plaster panels from a palace in Milan. But the panels were 18 feet high, and the ceiling Hoffman had designed was only 16 feet. So they had to cheat. They had to cut the panels. They had to lower floors. They had to build false walls. The construction of the interiors was a constant negotiation between the artifact and the architecture. The roof presented another problem. Chaffin wanted the roof to look old. He didn't want bright, new, red clay tiles. He wanted tiles that looked like they had been baking in the sun for 300 years. He wanted them covered in moss and lichen. He wanted them to look tired. You cannot buy tired tiles at a hardware store. So Deering sent an agent to Cuba. He found an entire village with crumbling, ancient roof tiles. He made them an offer. I will buy every roof in your village and replace them with brand new watertight tiles if you give me the old ones. The villagers agreed. They stripped the roofs of an entire Cuban town, crated up the dirty, moss-covered tiles, and shipped them to Miami. When you look at the roof of Vizcaya today, you are looking at the skyline of a vanished Cuban village, transplanted to Florida to satisfy the aesthetic craving of an American millionaire. But while Chaffin was obsessing over mossy tiles, James Deering was obsessing over technology. Deering was a man of the machine age. He made his fortune in tractors and harvesters. He loved gadgets, and he was determined that his 16th century palace would have the nervous system of a 20th century factory. Vizcaya was wired with a telephone system that rivaled a small city. There was a massive switchboard in the butler's pantry. Every guest room had a phone. You could call New York from your bedside table in 1916, a luxury that was almost unheard of. He installed a central vacuum system. There were brass ports in the baseboards of every room. The maids didn't have to carry heavy vacuums. They just plugged a hose into the wall, and a massive motor in the basement sucked the dust away. He installed elevators, but not just for people. He installed a complex system of dumbwaiters and lifts so that a servant never had to be seen carrying a tray. The food would move invisibly through the walls. He even installed a humidity control system. Deering knew that the Florida humidity would destroy his precious tapestries and paintings, so he built a primitive form of air conditioning. He designed the house with massive air shafts and fans that would pull the damp air out and circulate dry air. It wasn't modern AC, but it was a marvel of passive engineering. The clash between the old and the new was physical. You would walk into a room with a ceiling painted in the 1700s, walk across a rug woven for a Spanish king, and then press a mother-of-pearl button on the wall to summon a servant via an electric annunciator system. It was a cyborg house, ancient flesh on a robotic skeleton. But the human element of the construction was just as volatile. The relationship between Paul Chaffin and F. Burrell Hoffman was deteriorating. Chaffin was the visionary, the man with the grand ideas, but he was not a licensed architect. He couldn't do the math. Hoffman was the one making it stand up. Chaffin, however, was a narcissist. He wanted the credit. He began to erase Hoffman from the narrative. In the letters to Deering, Chaffin would refer to my designs and my plans. He treated Hoffman like a draftsman, a mere pencil for his genius. Hoffman, a quiet and professional man, grew increasingly frustrated. He was building a masterpiece, and his name was being scrubbed off the cornerstone before it was even laid. This tension created a strange atmosphere on the site. You had the imperious Charfin walking around with his cane, pointing at walls and demanding they be moved. You had the weary Hoffman recalculating the load-bearing stress of the coral rock. And you had the silent James Deering, watching it all, writing the checks, playing the two men against each other to get the best result. By 1916, the main house was largely finished. It stood on the edge of the bay, a shimmering golden-white apparition. It was beautiful, but it was stark. It looked like a palace dropped into a construction zone. The jungle had been pushed back, but the earth was raw. The house needed a frame. It needed a context. It needed the one thing that separates a house from an estate, a garden. But you cannot plant an Italian garden in a mangrove swamp. The soil is too salty. The sun is too hot. The plants of Tuscany, the cypress trees, the boxwoods, the olives, would die in a week in the Miami heat. This was the final, impossible problem. Charfin wanted the look of Italy, but he had the climate of the tropics. He needed a landscape architect who was a horticultural wizard. He needed someone who could find tropical plants that looked like Italian plants. He needed a botanist who could lie. Enter Diego Suarez. Diego Suarez was a young, Colombian-born landscape architect who had been trained in Italy. He understood the geometry of the Renaissance garden, the long axes, the hidden rooms, the fountains. But he also understood the tropical climate. When Deering hired Suarez, he gave him the hardest job on the site. "Give me the gardens of the Villa d'Este," Deering said, "but make them survive a hurricane." Suarez looked at the flat, salty mud of the backyard and realized he had to perform a miracle. He couldn't just plant flowers. He had to build the land itself. The house was finished. The furniture was uncreated. The roof tiles were aging in the sun. But the American Venice was still an island in a sea of mud. The battle for the gardens was about to begin, and it would require moving the earth, rerouting the water, and inventing a new kind of botany. The house was the body, but the garden would be the soul, and the soul was still missing. The creation of the gardens at Vizcaya was not a landscaping project. It was a war against geometry and geography. When Diego Suarez arrived in Miami, he looked out the back windows of the newly finished stone palace and saw a disaster. The land was flat. It was relentlessly, boringly flat. In Italy, the great Renaissance gardens of the Villa d'Este or the Boboli rely on drama. They rely on hills, terraces, and cascading waterfalls that use gravity to dazzle the eye. But in Coconut Grove, gravity is a rumor. There is no up or down. There is only the horizontal line of the swamp meeting the bay. Suarez knew that if he simply planted a garden on the flat dirt, the house would look ridiculous. It would look like a giant stone chest sitting on a billiard table. He needed to create a view. He needed to force perspective. He needed to lie to the eye. He sat at his drafting table, sweating in the tropical heat, and conceived of a plan that was pure theatrical genius. He designed the gardens in the shape of a fan. The lines of the paths would radiate out from the house, but they wouldn't be parallel. They would narrow as they got further away. It was an old stage trick. By tapering the paths, he made the garden look twice as long as it actually was. But the flatness was still the enemy. So Suarez ordered the construction of a mountain. It was called the Mound. Hundreds of laborers spent months dredging mud and rock from the bay and piling it up at the end of the garden axis. They built an artificial hill that blocked the view of the wild mangroves beyond. On top of this fake hill, Suarez built a casino, not a gambling hall, but a small, open-air garden folly. Now, when James Deering stood on the terrace of his house, he didn't see a flat swamp. He saw a long, majestic alley of trees leading his eye up to a hill capped by a beautiful stone pavilion. It looked like he was in the hills of Tuscany. It was a masterpiece of optical manipulation. The geography of Miami had been erased and replaced with a memory of Europe. But the botany was an even greater deception. Paul Charfin demanded the look of Italy. He wanted tall, dark cypress trees standing like sentinels. He wanted manicured boxwood hedges. He wanted the austere, dark green palette of the Mediterranean. But cypress trees die in the salt air. Boxwood rots in the humidity. So Suarez became a forger. He searched the tropical world for stunt doubles. Instead of Italian cypress, he planted Australian pines, casuarina trees. They were tall, thin, and dark green. If you squinted, they looked exactly like cypress. Instead of boxwood, he used jasmine and other tropical shrubs, clipping them into rigid geometric shapes. He created a green architecture that mimicked Italy but was biologically alien. It was a garden of impostors, surviving in the heat only because Suarez understood the secret language of the tropics. By Christmas Day, 1916, the stage was finally set. The house was scrubbed. The tired Cuban roof tiles were in place. The Australian pines were swaying in the breeze. The breakwater barge was breaking the waves. It was time for the king to arrive. James Deering did not take a taxi to his new home. That would have been too banal. He arrived by water. He boarded his yacht, the Nepenthe, in downtown Miami and sailed south across the bay. The name of the boat is significant. In Greek mythology, Nepenthe is a drug of forgetfulness, a potion used to erase sorrow. Deering was sailing toward oblivion. He was sailing away from his illness, away from the war in Europe, away from the stress of business. As the yacht rounded the point, the house revealed itself. It must have been a shocking sight. In the middle of the green, tangled coastline, a white Venetian palace rose out of the water, glowing in the afternoon sun. The stone barge sat in the foreground, with its carved mermaids welcoming him. Deering stepped onto the dock. He walked up the coral steps. He entered the house. And for the first time, the machine was turned on. The staff of Vizcaya was a small village. There were 30 house servants, endless gardeners, boat captains, and engineers. The house had to be run with the precision of a clock. The bachelor prince was a man of fastidious habits. He was a perfectionist who noticed if a fork was a millimeter out of alignment. The uniforms were a spectacle in themselves. Paul Chaffin, who treated the staff like extras in his movie, had designed specific costumes for different times of day. The footmen wore knee breeches and silk stockings for formal dinners. The housekeepers wore French-made uniforms that belonged in a farce. It was a cosplay of the 18th century, performed by Bohemians and Swedes in the middle of 1916 Miami. But the silence of the house was its most defining feature. Deering was a man who hated noise. He had silence signs placed in the staff corridors. He insisted that the servants wear soft-soled shoes so they wouldn't click on the marble floors. He wanted to live in a hushed, golden bubble. Yet a bubble is lonely, and a stage set needs an audience, so the invitations went out. The winter season at Vizcaya became the most coveted ticket in America. The guests who arrived at Vizcaya were entering a disorienting world. They would leave the freezing, cold-choked cities of the north, New York, Chicago, Boston, and take the train down the spine of Florida. They would arrive in the rough, frontier town of Miami, where cows still wandered onto the dirt roads. They would drive through the dark, menacing jungle hammock. And then they would be transporting to Venice. The contrast was jarring. Inside the gates, the world was refined, curated, and European. Outside the gates, the world was wild, dangerous, and American. You could drink champagne from a crystal flute in the tea room, looking out at a garden where an alligator might be sunning itself on a marble step. The visit was a performance. Deering and Chaffin had scripted the experience. In the morning, you might have breakfast on the loggia, watching the sun hit the stone barge. Then a swim in the pool. But this wasn't a normal pool. It was a half-indoor, half-outdoor pool located under the living room. You could swim out through large arches directly into the garden. The ceiling was covered in a mural of an undersea fantasy, painted by Robert Winthrop Chandler. It was dark, moody, and strange. Chandler was a wild character, a drunk, a genius, a giant of a man who terrified the fastidious Deering. While painting the ceiling, Chandler had lived at the house, throwing parties, spilling paint, and generally acting like the bohemian artist that Deering both admired and feared. The pool grotto remains one of the few places in the house where the madness of the artistic process is visible. The murals are trippy, depicting swaying coral and staring fish. It feels like swimming inside a fever dream. In the afternoon, there would be tea in the garden. But this wasn't just sitting on a bench. The gardens were designed as rooms. There was the secret garden, the maze, the theatre garden. Each one had a different mood. You could get lost in the geometry. You could have an illicit conversation behind a statue of a Roman god. But the nights were when Vizcaya truly flexed its power. The house was wired for electric light, but Charfin preferred the romance of flame. He would light hundreds of candles. The chandeliers would glitter. The guests would gather in the music room, surrounded by the fragile, gilded furniture imported from Milan. James Deering played the role of the host perfectly, but distantly. He was always impeccable in his white dinner jacket. He was polite. He was charming. But he was elusive. He would often retire early, leaving the guests to the party. He was a man watching his own life from a balcony. There is a tragic element to the social life of Vizcaya. It was a house built for a party that never really happened, or rather, a party that couldn't fix the underlying sadness of the host. Deering was surrounded by beauty, but he was dying. He was surrounded by people, but he was alone. The house was a magnificent shell, and he was a hermit crab living inside it. The relationship between Deering and Charfin began to strain under the weight of the completed project. Charfin didn't want to leave. He had built this world, and he wanted to live in it. He stayed on as a guest for months, then years. He acted like the master of the house. He rearranged the furniture. He criticized the staff. Deering, in his passive-aggressive way, began to tire of his creator. He was grateful for the house, yes, but he wanted his privacy back. He wanted to be the king, not the producer of Charfin's play. The tension between the two men, the wealthy industrialist and the aesthetic visionary, simmered in the hallways. They communicated through polite notes, through intermediaries, through the placement of objects. It was a cold war fought with porcelain and silk. And all the while, the real world was creeping closer. The United States entered World War I in 1917. The Nepenthe of Vizcaya could not block out the news forever. The German U-boats were sinking ships just off the coast of Florida. The escape was becoming a trap. The supplies of French wine and Italian cheese were cut off. The staff began to be drafted or leave for war work. The golden bubble of 1916 was popping. The house had been finished at the exact moment the world that inspired it, the aristocratic world of Europe, was being destroyed by mustard gas and machine guns. Vizcaya was a monument to a dead era before the paint was even dry. But the house didn't care about the war. The house had its own logic. The coral rock hardened in the sun. The Australian pines grew taller, their roots digging deep into the limestone. The stone barge sat in the water, immovable. One specific event captures the surreal nature of this time. It was the Dying Gaul incident. Deering had purchased a Roman statue, an antique copy of the famous Dying Gaul. It was a heavy, tragic piece of marble. He placed it in the garden, but the Florida climate is cruel. A hurricane brushed the coast. A palm tree fell. It smashed the Dying Gaul. Most men would be devastated. Deering simply looked at the shattered marble and the broken palm tree and saw it as appropriate. It was a ruin. It made the garden look even more authentic. He left the pieces there for a time. It was a symbol of what Vizcaya was, a beautiful, fragile thing constantly under assault by the violence of nature. As the 1920s approached, the bachelor prince was getting frailer. The pernicious anemia was taking its toll. He moved slower. He spent more time on the balcony, looking at the stone barge. He began to realize that he had built a house that would outlive him by centuries. He was a temporary tenant in his own dream. But before the end, there was one final massive intrusion: the prohibition. In 1920, the Volstead Act passed. Alcohol was illegal. For a man like Deering, who viewed a cocktail as a civilized necessity, this was a catastrophe. But Vizcaya once again had a secret. Deering and Charfin had anticipated this, or perhaps they just liked secrets. They had built a hidden room. Behind a sliding bookcase in the library, or tucked away in the billiard room, there were stashes. But the best secret was in the connection to the water. Smuggling in Miami became a major industry. The rum runners from the Bahamas would speed across the dark water of the bay, dodging the Coast Guard. Vizcaya, with its private dock, its dark lagoon, and its stone barge, was perfectly situated. There are rumors, never proven, but persistent, that the Nepenthe didn't just carry James Deering. It carried cases of the finest Scotch, unloaded in the dead of night, carried through the mangrove gardens, and stored in the cool, concrete cellars of the Italian palace. The house became a speakeasy for one, a fortress of wet resistance in a dry country. As Act 3 closes, we see James Deering standing on his terrace in the moonlight. The year is 1922. The jazz age is roaring in the north. The world is changing. But here, in the silence of the hammocks, time has stopped. The stone mermaids are watching him. The fake Italian trees are whispering in the wind. He has built the perfect world, but he is finding that perfection is a cold companion. The house is complete. The garden is grown. The dream is finished. And now there is nothing left to do but wait for the inevitable intruder that no gate can keep out: death. The twilight of James Deering was not a rage against the dying of the light. It was a slow, polite fading into the golden architecture he had created. By 1923, Vizcaya had settled into a rhythm of opulent silence. The construction noise was gone. The hammers were silent. The plants that Diego Suarez had so carefully placed were filling in, turning the raw geometry of the gardens into a lush, enclosing green wall. The illusion was complete. To a visitor standing on the tea-room loggia, looking out over the stone barge and the shimmering bay, it truly looked as if this house had been here for centuries, and James Deering was just the latest caretaker in a long line of Venetian doges. But the master of the house was becoming a ghost in his own life. The pernicious anemia was relentless. It sapped his energy, turning his skin translucent and his movements frail. He spent more and more time in his private suite on the second floor, a set of rooms designed to catch the cross breeze from the ocean. He became obsessed with the minutiae of the estate. He wrote endless memos to the staff. He worried about the cost of electricity. He worried about the salt spray on the ironwork. He was a man trying to control the uncontrollable entropy of the tropics, while his own body was failing to hold together. The relationship with Paul Chaffin had cooled to the point of permafrost. The artistic director, the man who had dreamed this world into existence, was no longer the resident genius. He was a visitor, and an infrequent one at that. The marriage of taste and money had ended in a separation. Deering was alone with his creation. In the summer of 1925, James Deering did what he had done for decades. He went to Europe. It was a ritual. He needed to see the doctors in Paris. He needed to visit the spas. He needed to reconnect with the civilization he had tried so hard to replicate in the swamp. He boarded the ocean liner SS City of Paris in September for the return journey to the United States. He was 65 years old. He never saw Vizcaya again. On September 21st, 1925, while the ship was crossing the Atlantic, James Deering died in his stateroom. It was a lonely, quiet end for the bachelor prince. He didn't die in the bed he had bought from a French chateau. He didn't die looking at his stone barge. He died in transit, suspended between the old world and the new, just as he had lived his life. His body was brought back to America, but not to Miami. He was buried in Chicago, in the cold, hard ground of the Midwest, far from the bougainvillea and the coral rock. When the news reached Miami, a strange paralysis fell over the estate. The staff was still there. The silver was still polished. The gardens were still manicured. But the center of gravity was gone. The house was suddenly an orphan. It passed to his nieces, Marion Deering McCormick and Barbara Deering Danielson. They were wealthy women, capable and intelligent, but they lived in the north. To them, Vizcaya was a winter place, a magnificent burden that their eccentric uncle had left behind. They barely had time to grieve before the sky turned black. If James Deering's death was the end of the dream, the great Miami hurricane of 1926 was the awakening. On September 18, 1926, the barometer in Miami began to drop with terrifying speed. The city was booming at the time. The Roaring Twenties land rush was in full swing. People were buying swampland sight unseen. Skyscrapers were rising. The population had exploded. But few of these new residents knew what a tropical cyclone actually was. They thought it was just a bad storm. F. Burrell Hoffman, the architect of Vizcaya, knew better. He had designed the house as a bunker for this exact moment. The hurricane slammed into the coast as a Category 4 monster. The wind speeds exceeded 150 miles per hour. The pressure was so low it caused nosebleeds, but the wind wasn't the killer, the water was. The storm surge that hit Biscayne Bay was a wall of water 10 feet high. It didn't just wash over the breakwater, it swallowed it. Vizcaya, sitting proudly on the water's edge, took the full force of the Atlantic Ocean. The stone barge, Alexander Sterling Calder's masterpiece of whimsy, was the first casualty. The massive stone mermaids were battered by waves that hit with the force of freight trains. The tea house on the deck of the barge was smashed to matchsticks. The trees planted on the stone deck were ripped out by the roots and hurled into the house. The barge, designed to protect the house, was overwhelmed. The water rose. It crested the terrace steps. It flooded the formal gardens. The secret garden, the theatre garden, the maze, all of Diego Suarez's careful geometry was submerged under a churning slurry of salt water, mud, and debris. Then the water breached the house. It poured into the lower loggias. It smashed through the glass doors of the tea room. It flooded the basement. The intricate heating and cooling systems, the central vacuum motors, the elevators, the nervous system of the house were drowned in salt water. The swimming pool grotto, with its fantastical ceiling painted by Robert Winthrop Chandler, became a literal sea cave. The water rose to the ceiling, soaking the plaster, turning the undersea fantasy into a real undersea ruin. But the house stood. Hoffman's reinforced concrete held. The steel beams didn't buckle. The roof, anchored with heavy Cuban tiles, stayed on. While wooden houses all over Miami were exploding into shrapnel, Vizcaya stood like a coral rock cliff. When the eye of the storm passed and the winds finally died down, the house was battered, scarred, and soaked, but it was still standing. The gardens, however, were a graveyard. Diego Suarez returned to see the damage and wept. His work was destroyed. The salt water had killed the plants. The Australian pines were snapped like twigs. The mound was eroded. The beautiful, manicured illusion of Italy had been erased, replaced by a tangled mess of mud and dead branches. The jungle had fought back, and the jungle had won. The cleanup was a Herculean task. The nieces, Marion and Barbara, were faced with a bill that would make a modern insurance company faint. But they were Deerings. They had the harvester fortune. They didn't walk away. They wrote the checks. They repaired the barge. They pumped out the basement. They replanted the gardens. But it was never quite the same. The original, pristine perfection of 1916 was gone. The house now had scars. It had a history of violence. It looked, for the first time, genuinely old. But the hurricane was just the opening act of the disaster. 3 years later, in 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression descended on America like a lead blanket. The roaring 20s were over. The era of the Gilded Age estate was officially dead. The idea of spending tens of thousands of dollars a year to maintain a winter palace for 8 weeks of vacation became obscene, even for the wealthy. Marion and Barbara tried to keep it going. They opened the house for a few weeks in the winter. They hosted small gatherings, but the staff was cut. The uniforms were simplified. The sheer extravagance of the Deering era was dialed back. Vizcaya went into a state of suspended animation. During the 1930s, the house sat quietly in the heat, a white elephant waiting for a purpose. The humidity worked its slow magic on the tapestries. The termites found the antique wood. The salt air continued its microscopic assault on the stone. The nieces realized that they were fighting a losing battle. They couldn't live there. It was too big, too sad, too expensive. But they couldn't sell it. Who buys a 180-acre estate with a 70-room palace during the Great Depression? There were rumors of developers circling again. They looked at the gardens and saw golf courses. They looked at the house and saw a hotel. There was talk of turning Vizcaya into a casino. There was talk of turning it into an embassy. But the family held on. They felt a duty to James Deering's vision. They understood that this wasn't just a house. It was a work of art. You don't sell the Mona Lisa to a pawn shop just because you need cash. Then came the Second World War. Miami was transformed into a military training ground. The hotels of South Beach were requisitioned as barracks for the Army Air Corps. The beaches were patrolled for German U-boats. Vizcaya, once again, was surrounded by war. The family offered the use of the gardens to the military for rest and relaxation. Soldiers training for the Pacific or Europe would wander through the Italian gardens on their leave. Imagine the contrast. Young American GIS in khaki uniforms, smoking cigarettes, sitting on the statues of Roman gods, looking at a stone barge that had been built for a dead millionaire's tea parties. It was during these years that the idea of the museum began to take shape. The nieces realized that the era of private ownership was ending. The tax burden was crushing. The cost of labor had skyrocketed. The world where you could hire 30 people to polish silver for $2 a day was gone forever. If Vizcaya was going to survive the 20th century, it had to stop being a home. It had to become a monument. But making that transition is not easy. A house is a private organism. A museum is a public institution. To turn Vizcaya into a museum meant inviting the world in, not just the elite guests with their invitations, but the public, the tourists, the children, the people James Deering had spent millions of dollars trying to hide from. In the late 1940s, negotiations began. The family approached Dade County, now Miami-Dade County. They offered a deal similar to the one Gladys Vanderbilt made in Newport, but even more generous. They would sell the house and the gardens to the county for a fraction of their value. They would donate the art. They would give the Bachelor Prince's treasure chest to the people of Miami. The county was hesitant. It was a massive liability. Miami was a young, gritty city. Did it really want a crumbling Italian palace? Did the taxpayers want to foot the bill for fixing the roof of a dead capitalist? There were arguments in the commission meetings. Some politicians wanted to bulldoze it and build a park. Some wanted to use the land for public housing. The fate of Vizcaya hung by a thread. It was the same battle that had played out at Lyndhurst, at the Breakers, at Hearst Castle. The tension between the value of history and the cost of maintenance. But the beauty of the place was its own best argument. When the commissioners walked through the courtyard, when they heard the water lapping against the stone barge, when they saw the light hitting the coral rock, they succumbed to the spell. They realized that if they destroyed this, they could never build it again. It was unique. It was the American Venice. In 1952, the deal was signed. The Deering family handed over the keys. They packed up their personal effects. They took the photos of James Deering off the mantels, and they walked away. The iron gates that had been locked against the world for 40 years were prepared to open. The private sanctuary of the most reclusive man in America was about to become the most public room in Miami. But the transition would not be smooth. The house was tired. The systems were failing. The roof leaked. And on the horizon, there was always the threat of the next storm. The family had saved it from the developers, but now the county had to save it from time itself. The era of the curator was about to begin. The sleeping beauty of Biscayne Bay was about to be woken up by the flashbulbs of tourists, and the first thing they would discover was that the house was not empty. It was full of secrets that James Deering had left behind in the walls, secrets that were waiting to be decoded by a new generation. The silence was over. The tour buses were coming. The transition of Vizcaya from a private fortress to a public museum in 1953 was a culture shock that Miami was barely prepared for. In the early 50s, Miami was the city of the future. It was the era of Morris Lapidus and the Fontainebleau Hotel. It was the age of neon, chrome, tail fins, and air conditioning. It was a city obsessed with the new. And sitting right in the middle of this atomic-age boomtown was a decaying, silent, 16th-century Italian palace built by a ghost. When the county opened the doors to the public, the reaction was a mixture of awe and confusion. Tourists wearing Hawaiian shirts and smoking cigarettes walked through the massive iron gates of the Pisani Palace. They wandered through the Rococo reception rooms where James Deering had once stood in his white suit, sipping sherry in silence. They touched the walls. They asked where the air conditioning was. There wasn't any. They looked at the stone barge and wondered why a boat was made of rock. For the first time, the legend of Vizcaya, the carefully constructed fiction of the 4 generations of Venetian owners, was exposed to the harsh light of reality. The curators had a massive job. They had to explain that this wasn't a real European castle. It was an American dream of Europe. They had to catalogue thousands of objects that Deering and Chaffin had bought during their frenzied shopping sprees in 1912. They found things in drawers that hadn't been opened in 30 years. They found receipts from Roman antiquarians, sketches by Chaffin, and bottles of Prohibition-era liquor hidden in the cellars. But a museum is not just a building with tickets. It is a bank vault with windows. And in the case of Vizcaya, the vault was dangerously insecure. James Deering had filled the house with small, precious objects. He didn't just buy massive tapestries. He bought silver, gold, jade, and diamonds. He treated the house like a jewelry box. And for decades, the only security system was the isolation of the estate and a few night watchmen. On the night of March 22, 1971, the vulnerability of the American Venice was ruthlessly exploited. This is the story of the Great Vizcaya Heist, a crime that remains one of the most tragic and unsolved mysteries in the history of art theft. It plays out like a Hollywood movie, but the ending is far more bitter. It was a dark, humid night. 3 men scrambled over the perimeter wall. They weren't cat burglars using high-tech lasers. They were brutes. They crept through the jungle gardens, avoiding the lights, moving toward the south side of the main house. They climbed up to the second-floor balcony, possibly using the dense vines that Diego Suarez had planted to make the house look old. They smashed a glass door. The sound of breaking glass shattered the silence of 50 years. Once inside, they moved with terrifying speed. They encountered the night watchman. They didn't use tranquilizer darts. They used duct tape and wire. They tied him up. They threatened his life. And then they went shopping. They didn't take the paintings. They were too big. They didn't take the furniture. It was too heavy. They went for the smalls. They went for the soul of the collection. They smashed the display cases in the sitting rooms. They swept shelves clean. They took a silver bowl that had belonged to Napoleon Bonaparte. They took a diamond-encrusted box that had belonged to Catherine the Great. They took solid gold candelabras. They took antique watches. They took the tangible, glittering history that Deering and Chaffin had so carefully curated. In less than an hour, they stripped the house of approximately $1.5 million worth of art. In today's value, that is tens of millions of dollars. But the monetary value is irrelevant. These were unique historical artifacts. The thieves vanished into the night. They escaped through the mangroves, disappearing into the Miami darkness. When the police arrived the next morning, the scene was heartbreaking. The glass was shattered on the marble floors. The velvet linings of the display cases were empty. The jewelry box had been gutted. A massive investigation was launched. The FBI was involved. Interpol was notified. There were leads, rumors, and arrests of local petty criminals in New York and Miami. Some of the men were eventually caught and convicted for the theft, but the tragedy was the loot. The vast majority of the stolen items were never recovered. The police suspect that the thieves, ignorant of the historical value, did the unthinkable. They didn't sell the Napoleon bowl to a collector. They melted it down. They likely took priceless Renaissance silver, hammered by the greatest silversmiths of Europe, and turned it into ingots of raw metal to be sold for scrap weight. They pried the diamonds out of the snuff boxes and threw the gold casings away. The heist changed Vizcaya forever. The innocence of the open house was gone. The security was tightened to fortress levels. Sensors, cameras, and laser grids were installed. The small, delicate objects that remained were locked away in vaults or placed behind bulletproof glass. The house became harder, colder, and more distant. It was no longer just a home. It was a crime scene. But the house had to survive more than just thieves. It had to survive its own celebrity. In 1987, Vizcaya found itself on the global stage. in a way James Deering never could have imagined. President Ronald Reagan chose the estate as the location for a historic meeting with Pope John Paul II. The logistics were staggering. The Secret Service descended on the property. They swept the gardens for bombs. They put snipers on the roof of the casino. They turned the bachelor's paradise into a high-security diplomatic compound. On September 10, 1987, the Pope arrived. The images from that day are surreal. You see the pontiff, dressed in his white robes, walking through the formal Italian gardens. You see him standing on the East Terrace with the stone barge in the background. It was a visual collision of two kinds of faith, the spiritual faith of the Vatican and the material faith of the Gilded Age. James Deering, a man who had built this house to escape the world, had inadvertently built the perfect stage for the world's most famous leaders. The house performed beautifully. The coral stone glowed in the television lights. The gardens looked immaculate. For a moment, Vizcaya was exactly what Paul Chaffin had intended it to be, a palace fit for a king, or in this case, a pope. But while the popes and presidents came and went, the real enemy was tireless, silent, and chemical. The salt. The location of Vizcaya is its glory and its curse. By building directly on the bay, Deering ensured that every stone, every iron gate, and every tapestry was subjected to a constant, corrosive mist of salt water. By the 1990s, the house was sick. The iron reinforcing bars inside the concrete, the very steel skeleton that F. Burrell Hoffman had used to save the house from hurricanes, were rusting. When steel rusts, it expands. This expansion was cracking the concrete from the inside out. The house was slowly exploding in slow motion. The stone barge was in critical condition. The mermaids were dissolving. The limestone, battered by decades of waves and storms, was turning back into sand. The breakwater that protected the house was in danger of collapsing into the bay. The county had to launch a massive, multi-million-dollar rescue mission. This is the unglamorous reality of modern preservation. It isn't about finding hidden treasure, it's about chemistry. They had to install a cathodic protection system. This involved drilling thousands of holes into the historic stone and inserting titanium anodes that run an electrical current through the steel to stop it from rusting. They essentially turned the house into a giant battery to save it from the salt. They had to restore the barge. They couldn't just patch it. They had to quarry new stone, matching the original oolite. They had to hire sculptors to recarve the mermaids using photos from 1916. It was a restoration of a folly, spending millions to save a fake boat that could never sail. And then a new threat emerged, one that even Hoffman hadn't planned for. Climate change. James Deering built his terrace just a few feet above the high tide line of 1916, but the water is higher now. During the king tides in the autumn, the Atlantic Ocean doesn't need a hurricane to breach the walls. It just rises. In recent years, the curators have watched with dread as the saltwater bubbles up through the drains in the gardens. They have seen the water lap over the edges of the barge and spill onto the lower terraces. The American Venice is facing the same fate as the real Venice. It is slowly sinking, or rather, the ocean is slowly swallowing it. The curators are now fighting a defensive war. They have installed floodgates. They have raised the electrical systems. They are planting salt-tolerant mangroves in the buffer zones, returning parts of the garden to the wild to protect the center. It is a poetic irony. To save the Italian fantasy, they have to invite the Florida jungle back in. Today, walking through Vizcaya is a haunting experience. It feels different from other Gilded Age estates. The Breakers feels like a fortress of power. Hearst Castle feels like a movie set, but Vizcaya feels like a dream that is slowly waking up. The house is filled with a heavy, golden silence. When you walk through the courtyard, you can hear the faint sound of the fountain, which was designed to sound like a babbling brook to soothe Deering's nerves. You can smell the jasmine and the salt air. The ghost of James Deering is everywhere. You see him in the telephone room, where he kept his charts of the stock market. You see him in the invalid's chair, a mechanical wheelchair preserved in the upper hallway. You feel his obsession in the way the light hits the floor in the tea room. But the most powerful presence is the view. Stand on the east terrace today, and you look out at the stone barge. Beyond it, the skyline of Miami rises from the water like a glass mountain range. The contrast is violent. On one side of the barge is the 16th century, on the other side is the 21st. Vizcaya sits between them, a fragile membrane of memory. It is a house built on a lie, the lie that you can buy the past, that you can import culture, that you can build a fortress against time. And yet, the lie has become the truth. The fake Italian stones have weathered enough storms to become real Florida history. The stunt double trees have grown roots deep enough to hold the earth. The story of Vizcaya is the story of Miami itself. It is a place built by dreamers and speculators on the edge of a swamp, constantly threatened by wind and water, yet managing to create something blindingly beautiful out of the chaos. As the sun sets over the mangroves, the lights in the house come on. They are electric now, not candles. The tour buses have gone. The gates are locked. The security lasers grid the gardens. Inside, the empty rooms wait. The table is set in the dining room for a dinner that ended 90 years ago. The tapestries hang in the dark, breathing the conditioned air. And out on the water, the stone mermaids stare blindly at the rising tide, guarding the bachelor prince's palace against the long, slow siege of the sea. The dream is over, but the stone remains. And as long as the barge breaks the waves, the illusion holds. This has been the Manor Files.